I previously mentioned that clicking on this edit icon will open this examples code in codesandbox.io, and in codesandbox.io we can modify the code and play around with the example code. So that is one very nice way of trying out Material UI components. If you want to include Material UI components in our React project, then we will have to add a couple of npm packages to our React project. So let us do that, and let us do an example involving a couple of components that we discussed earlier. To do the example, we will need a React project that has been created using create react app command line tool. If you already have one, you can use that, or you can create using this command npx create react app followed by name of the application. Once the command completes, cd into that folder, and from within the folder, type npm space start. And as usual, that will open localhost :3000 in a new browser tab, and also open the folder in VS Code. So I have done that, and also under the src folder, I have created a subfolder called components, and within the components folder, I have created a subfolder called material_UI_examples, and I will be putting my example code in this folder. Now let us add the npm packages related to Material UI to this React project. If you go to material-ui.com, under getting started, there will be a subheading called installation. So if we go to that page, we can find instructions for installing Material UI packages. What this page asks us to do is, it asks us to install two npm packages. The first is @material-ui/core, and that is the core package for Material UI. And the second is @material-ui/icons. This is listed as optional, but for all practical purposes, we will need icons. So usually we install this package also along with the core package. So let's add these two packages first. I'll stop my development server and I'll type npm install. The first package is @material-ui/core. So I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste that out here. And the icons package is @material-ui/icons. So I'm going to copy that also, and I'm going to paste that here, and I'll click enter. That should install @material-ui/icons and @material-ui/core to your React project. Once that is done, come back to the installation page. We also have to add a couple of fonts to our project. The installation page says that Material-UI was designed with the Roboto font in mind. So we'll have to add the Roboto font to our project. To do that, copy this link tag over here and go to VS Code and open index.html under the public folder. And in index.html, add that link somewhere in the head section. So I'm going to paste that link over here just above title. I'll save that. Come back to the installation page. We have to add one more font, and that font is for the icons. So copy this link tag over here listed under font icons, and again in index.html, paste it in the head section. So I have done that, and let's save the file. And now we are finished with our initial setup of Material UI in our React project. Let's quickly review what we have done once again. We have installed @material-ui/core package, and we have added the Roboto font. We have also added the font for the icons, and we have also added one npm package for icons, which is @material-ui/icons. So we have added two npm packages and two fonts to our React project. If you go to package.json, under dependencies, you will find two new entries corresponding to @material-ui/core, @material-ui/icons. Now let us proceed to doing our example. Let's look at the UI wireframe of what we are going to implement. In the top row, we have some text which says hello world from Material UI. In the second row, we have some buttons, and in the third row, we have some more buttons. And the functionality that we want is all of these should be centered. This text as well as these buttons should be centered horizontally. And clicking on one of these buttons, let's say clicking on this button over here, should open a snack bar which looks like this. This snack bar should have a message which says you clicked me, and it should have a button to close the snack bar. So clicking on this X over here should close this snack bar. And also, if you do not click this X icon over here, the snack bar should anyway close by itself after 5 seconds. So this is what we are going to implement. I will start my development server because I had stopped it previously. So I'm going to type npm space start to start it. So that should start the development server. And as usual, it should open localhost :3000 in a new browser tab. Now let us go to VS Code, and I'm going to add a file to this folder material_ui_examples. So I'm going to select this folder, and I'm going to add a new file to it, and I'm going to call that file buttons and snackbar.js. This is going to be a function component. So let's write function buttons and snack bar, and it has to return some JSX. So let's write a return statement. Let's take a look at the UI wireframe and figure out which components we need from Material UI. At the top, we have some text, and we will be using the typography component for this text. And below this text, we have some buttons, and we will be using the button component for these buttons. And for laying out these components like this, we will be using the grid component. So we'll use the typography component for this text, button component for these buttons, and for layout, we will use the grid component. So let's import them. Let's implement this snack bar after we get the initial layout of this text and these buttons working. So I'm going to type import typography, button, grid from single quotes @material-ui/core. Let's close the single quotes. Let's add an empty root tag and close it as well. Let's put this text in a grid container element. So I'm going to write grid, and I'm going to specify container over here, and I'll close the tag. And within the grid container element, let's add a grid item like this, grid item, and let's close the tag. And let's put our text as the content of this grid item. And the text is hello world from Material UI. So I'm going to type hello world from Material UI. Let's quickly discuss what we have written here. We have a grid container, and within that we have a grid item, and we have put our content within the grid item. If we go to the documentation for the grid component, there is a link to the CSS Tricks website which contains a Flexbox tutorial. Let's quickly open that. If you see the diagrams under Flexbox properties, on the left, this diagram over here depicts what a container means, and this diagram over here depicts what items mean. So we have a container, and within the container we have items. And the grid component uses the CSS's Flexbox module, and that is why we are using the container and item props over here. So the point to remember is that we will have grid containers, and grid items will be children of the grid containers. So this is how we can start laying out our UI using the grid component. Let's export this component and look at what the output looks like. So let's go to app.js, and let's remove this header section over here, and let's specify our component over here, buttons and snack bar. And as you can see, VS Code has added the import statement for me. If you go to the web page, we can see some text here. Let me zoom in just a little bit. As you can see, we have some text over here. So our code is working, but let us style it now. So let's go to buttons and snackbar.js, and let's use the typography component for styling. So I'm going to type typography over here, and I'm going to close the tag over here. Let's adjust the indentation a little bit. And for props, let's specify the variant prop, variant equals, and let's specify h5 over here. So this corresponds to the h5 header tag. So let's look at the output now. Let's go to the web page. Let's inspect this element. So I have right clicked and I'm going to click on inspect. As you can see here, the text hello world from Material UI has been rendered within a h5 header tag. So when we specified the variant as h5, the typography component rendered the h5 header tag for us. Now let us center this text. If we want to center our grid items, we have to do that in the grid container. So we'll specify justify equals center in the grid container. So what we have done is we have specified justify equal to center for the grid container. So let's take a look at the output and see if our content got centered. As you can see here, the content is now centered. Now we have to add one more grid container and put these buttons inside that grid container. So let's do that. But before we do that, let's go to the documentation for the button component at material-ui.com. And you can find the buttons that we want under contained buttons. Like we discussed previously, if we want contained buttons, we have to specify the variant as contained. By the way, this is the very example that we are also implementing. So we can copy this code and use that in our example. But I recommend typing out this code so that we can get some practice. Before we start typing out the code for the button components, we have to add a grid container for these buttons. So let's do that first. So I'm going to type grid container, and let's specify justify equals center, because we want our buttons to be centered as well. And within the grid container, each button needs to go into its own grid item. So let's write grid item, and let's place our first button within this grid item. So this is a contained button and its color is default. So let's add that first. So I'm going to type button variant equals contained, and let's specify the color as default, and the text is going to be default. Let's add the JSX for the next button. So this is a button with the primary color. So let's add that. That also needs to go into its own grid item. So let's add the grid item first. And within the grid item, let's specify button. And let's specify the variant prop as contained. And let's specify the color as primary. And let's specify primary as the label. Let's quickly take a look at the output to see how it looks. As you can see here, we have two buttons, but they're right next to each other without any space between them. So let's add some space between them. And to add space between grid items, we have to specify the spacing prop for the grid container. So let's do that. So I'm going to specify spacing equals 2 over here for the grid container. So what we have done is we have specified spacing equals 2 for the grid container. Let's save the file and let's take a look at the output. As you can see, there is some space now between these two buttons. Actually, the space is between the grid items, and we have specified the spacing value as 2. And previously I mentioned that by default each spacing value corresponds to 8px. So a spacing value of 2 corresponds to 8 times 2, that is 16px. Now let us add the third button, and this button has a secondary color and the label is secondary. So let's add that. So that button also has to go into its own grid item. So I'm going to type grid item, and the button variant will be contained as well, but the color will be different. The color needs to be secondary and the label needs to be secondary. Let's take a look at the fourth button. This button is disabled, so let's add that. That needs to go into its own grid item as well. So I'm going to type that first, and I'm going to put button component within that. The variant is going to be contained for this button as well, and we are going to add the disabled prop for this button, and the label of this button is going to be disabled. Next, let us add the JSX for the fifth button. This button needs to have the primary color, and it is going to be a link button. So let's add that. This button also needs to go into its own grid item. So let's add that first, and we'll put our button inside the grid item. The variant is going to be contained for this button as well, and we'll specify the color as primary, and we'll specify the href attribute. Let's specify contained -buttons for the href attribute, and let's specify the label as link. And let's close the tag over here. Let's take a look at the output to see how it looks. And as you can see here, we have 5 buttons of the contained variant type. You can see that this button has the primary color, and this button has the secondary color, this button is disabled, and this button has the default color. And this button over here is actually a anchor tag because we have specified the href attribute. Now we have to add the buttons for the third row. Let's go to the documentation for the button component. And as you can see here, the buttons that we want are outlined buttons. That means we have to specify the variant as outlined for these buttons. So let's add them as well. The only difference between this row of buttons and this row of buttons is that the top row of buttons are contained buttons and the bottom row of buttons are outlined buttons. That is the only difference. So what we'll do is we'll copy the JSX for the contained buttons, including the grid container and the grid items, and let us paste that as the third container. And what we'll do is we'll just modify this contained value to outlined. So let's do that. So I'm going to select all of the values and I'm going to modify them to say outlined, and I'm going to save the file. Let's take a look at the output to see how it looks. And as you can see, we have our outlined buttons below the contained buttons. So we have implemented this part of the UI wireframe. Next, we have to implement this snack bar. But before we go to the snack bar, let's quickly review what we have done up to this point. We have imported 3 components, typography, button, and grid from material-ui/core, and we use the grid component for laying out our components. What we have done is we have placed 3 grid containers. This is the grid container that corresponds to the top row over here, and this grid container corresponds to the second row over here, and this grid container corresponds to the third row over here. And each of the grid containers have one or more grid items within them. And the grid items is where we actually put our content, whether it is text or buttons. And we specified justify equals center to center everything. And we wanted some space between each of the grid items, so we specified spacing equals 2. And by default, 1 unit of spacing equals 8px. So spacing equals 2 means that we have given 2 times 8px, which is 16px, as the spacing between the grid items. To implement this text, we use the typography component, and we specified the variant as h5, and this will generate a h5 header tag. To implement these buttons, we use the button tag, and we specified the variant as contained. And to implement these buttons, we used the button tag for them also, but we specified the variant as outlined for them. Next, let us discuss how to use the snack bar component.